Well, greetings and welcome, Stephens community. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome any traditional residential students who may be joining us, any graduate students, online students. I want to welcome faculty, welcome staff, welcome any alumni, welcome any Board of Trustee members, and welcome any Columbia community members. So welcome to the first of 9 webinars. It is called the Think, Speak, Do series of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we are excited to be launching this. We thank you for all who have registered for this webinar or any of the other ones. We will share the topic 1 week at a time. So hopefully you will travel this journey with us. We want to model the fact that in this work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we don't get to know all the information. We don't even know the next steps sometimes. But the fact is we are in it, doing it, and taking action. So thank you for engaging in this journey with us. I'd like to thank Lita, who is working behind the scenes. And I personally want to acknowledge and apologize that I had a PowerPoint up and I think you all were seeing boxes or a bar. And so not quite sure why that's doing it. And Lita and I had a test run. So technology is trying to be resistant in a negative way today, but it's okay. We'll figure out a way to overcome it. So we're going to do our best to open up the PowerPoint, and hopefully you all will be able to see some of that material. So can you all see any slide? Yes, okay. Beautiful. So I am not a sole person in this work. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is everyone's responsibility. And there are a few of us that are tapped to facilitate it and lead it in different ways. So I'm blessed to be part of what we've branded the last couple months as the equity offices. So of course, I'm Shaashawn Dial. I serve as the inaugural director of diversity, equity, and inclusion with Stephens. And I'm blessed to work consistently with Shannon Walls, who's another alumna. And Shannon is the Title IX coordinator, special assistant to the president, and Sadie Mayerstrand is our ADA coordinator, and of course, the director of the Student Success Center. So we are working together to make sure that our processes and procedures are parallel. We possess the ultimate goal of having one policy that all students can view and see. And we also put out a email that is kind of in the form of a newsletter twice a month. And so we hope that you will read that and provide feedback to us. So I am seeing some chat that you can't see the slide. Can you see anything now? I'll keep going as I wait for feedback. So the purpose of our Think, Speak, Do Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion webinar series is for us as an institution comprised of many constituents to have a common DEI vocabulary. Anytime we are engaging in anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic, anti-Islamophobic work, we can't just jump straight into it. By jumping, we need to have a vocabulary. So we're going to work on that today. And also, we are dialoguing to action. It is one thing to read a lot of books and watch TED Talks and podcasts, but every single day, if you are not making your life uncomfortable as an ally, if you are not walking more boldly in your truths and your identities, then it's just talk. And we definitely have so much going on in the world that we must be doing action. So because this is challenging and layered and complicated and rich and sometimes frustrating work, it is important that we just take a moment. We are all coming to this space and sharing virtual space from a plethora of physical locations, We've probably answered emails and phone calls today. We could have been sitting in several Zoom meetings. We may have been tending to loved ones, be that aging parents, if those of you who are co-parents, who are raising children, siblings, partners, spouses. And so we want to take a moment to just honor the path that you've navigated to get to this moment. So if you are able, and as you are able, get comfortable where you are. And I'm going to encourage you to take 3 breaths at your own pace. Do your best to inhale as deeply as you can and as you are physically able, and exhale. And as you're doing that, just give a little bit of gratitude for all that you've already accomplished and done before this moment. So 3 breaths at your own pace. And as you continue to center, we want to ground ourselves in this moment. And we want to acknowledge. We want to acknowledge our indigenous kin who had this land before any of us were thought about. We want to acknowledge the ancestors, the positive energy spirits that exist in your worlds and in your traditions. We also want to acknowledge that so much is happening every single day. We want to make room for those who are grieving loved ones, for the families of 2 individuals who were lynched in California. We want to celebrate a historic, her historic, their historic, them historic Supreme Court ruling that came out earlier this week, protecting LGBT folks and their employment rights and status. So there is incredible strides being made every day, and there is also incredible pain and loss and turmoil. And so we ground ourselves that both of those truths hold space simultaneously. And breathing. I encourage you to breathe throughout this, especially if you hear something that doesn't resonate well, that may feel off or make you feel defensive or uncomfortable. It is okay. Breathe. So community agreements. So we did not do this particular section on our June 4th virtual gathering, but we will do this in each of our next webinars. So anytime we're sharing virtual space, guess what, amazing people? We are part of a community and multiple communities. And so we need some agreements when we come together, when we are doing this challenging, rich work around racism. So we will honor confidentiality in this space. So if someone says something in the chat, or if we get to a place where we can dialogue a little bit and we unmute, we ask that you not take someone's personal story outside of this space unless you gain permission from that specific person. Because if you take it without their permission, you are violating them mentally, physically, spiritually. And so Anissa Ward, who is a colleague in this work, she says, what is learned here leaves here in terms of concepts. So if you have an aha moment, if you connect a vocabulary term or a concept, or you figure out a way that this information impacts you on a daily basis here at Stephens, then that leaves with you. But if someone shares something very personal, i.e. they self-identify, right, with a specific identity, or they share something that they may have experienced outside of Stephens or at Stephens, you cannot run and go tell a colleague who was not here. That would be a violation. So we will honor confidentiality. I encourage you to practice active listening as much as possible and sit in uncomfortability, defensiveness, and awkwardness. Those are all signs that you're growing. If you don't know, ask. So if there's an acronym or something, ask. Definitely you could go do your own homework and you can Google, but I just don't want you to walk away from any of these or navigate away from any of these experiences and just applying your own assumptions. I'm going to ask ambiverts to keep moving in and moving out. So if you don't know, an ambivert is a person who is pretty good They have extroverted and introverted qualities, and depending on the context and the situation, they know when to move in and when to move out. Maybe share once, then the second time, instead of sharing, they call out or acknowledge someone else to share. Extroverts, I'm going to ask you to self-monitor, and I am one, so I'm speaking to myself, is that extroverts, we, for the most part, like public speaking. It's easy. It's like breathing. And we like to think we're pretty brilliant. And so we always have something we can say. The challenge with that, though, is we can also dominate a room or a conversation. So I'm asking extroverts to please self-monitor. You can share something and maybe share twice, but on that third time you get ready to share, I'm going to ask you to instead encourage an introvert to speak up. And introverts, I'm speaking to you, brilliant ones. I need you to dare to share, because if you don't, you're being selfish. Because my guess is you will think about something, you will flip that coin, you will pro-con it, you want to make sure that the delivery is right, you've thought about the different perceptions people could take from it, and if there's a little bit of ambiguity, then you choose not to share it all. But then you rob us of your perfection and of your thoughts. And so dare to share, do not be selfish. We need to hear from you, because you may drop the nugget of wisdom or a gift that helps somebody else connect some concepts. And again, I've repeated it, sit in uncomfortability, defensiveness, and awkwardness. So very quickly, we're going to review our social justice framework. So remember, as we do this work, racism, and we've been focusing for these first 2 weeks specifically on racism, and know that all oppression is connected, right? So racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, anti-Semitism, they're all connected. So racism, like all forms of oppression, is pervasive and it hurts us all. So it hurts people of color, it hurts white people. It does hurt us differently, and so therefore we have different work to do as we combat it. Racism is both a system of oppression and a system of advantage based on skin color. All racial prejudice was taught to us, and we can choose to resist that teaching. We can unlearn what we've learned. None of us invented racism. It is a legacy that we inherited. We did not create it. We now must accept responsibility for it and our role in it. And we've got to make that decision every single day. So you'll never hear me say that this work is easy. It's challenging. If we don't accept the responsibility, then we are part of its continued existence. We are complicit. All prejudices and oppressions are interwoven and entangled. All of us have had the experience as a target of oppression, as well as the experience of privilege. And that's often on the individual level and maybe communal. And remember, a lot of times we'll be talking about systemic racism, which means what's happening across broad groups with power. There is no such thing as a passive anti-racism. So I'm sure that you've been hearing in the national dialogues that it's no longer, and it never was, but it's no longer very clear in the times we live in that you can't just say, I'm not racist, right? You have to be engaging in anti-racist acts every single day. So we're either actively working against it or we're colluding with it. Individuals, communities, and organizations can and do grow and change. And that is the hope. We can be part of transformative acts. Our commitment to eliminating racism and all forms of injustice must be a lifelong one. And this is challenging because how many of us want to sign up for work that there isn't a finite destination point? It almost seems counterintuitive. But this is the work, and we're definitely going to do a lot of talking about that today. And of course, difference among humans is not a deficit. We are not trying to fix each other. These are not systemic racism is not the problem of individual Black folks or Indigenous folks or Latinx folks. It is about power and systems. So cultural diversity is a gift. Hopefully you're getting familiar with this graphic. right? To help us show, again, the progression, the journey that we're on. Remembering diversity is the individual characteristics. Equality is treating everyone the same. It is colorblindness, and it often does not recognize or bring into conversation and action the historical isms in our US social institutions. Equity does. And so we're striving to become an equity-minded or a more intentional equity-minded institution where we do account for differences in individuals and groups, and we do acknowledge the historical exclusion to access opportunities and power and resources in our US systems. We are color conscious unapologetically. That's what we're moving towards. And we want to be cognizant of the inequities and the disparities that exist, again, to resources, access, and opportunities. And our final review is US social institutions. So when we talk about systemic racism, this is what we're talking about: government, medicine, finance and banking, religion, media, education, and our law enforcement, legal. So we are talking about the access to resource opportunities through these US institutions. And if you remember our power analysis from our community Zoom on June 4th, you'll remember that all of these institutions that we're looking at right now were made by and for white people under whose policies and laws people of color had to live. We cannot say the same. There are no US institutions that were created by and for people of color under whose policies and laws white people had to live. So on a systemic level, there cannot be reverse racism. On a systemic level, it is about power. So this is a new introduction, and you'll probably see these for one of each of our future webinars, which is 4 levels of change. This isn't flat, but I know it's represented flat, but just want to show that this is why this work is complicated. It is and both, not either or, because we are making individual change. Again, what are we doing as individuals every single day to learn more, to intervene? There's communal change, all the communities we are a part of. So as students, that could be your major, that you're an athlete, your co-curriculars, maybe you have a full or a part-time job. Those are all parts of communities. We have organizational change, so things Stephens is doing. And then Stephens is part of an institution, the institution of education, higher education, but still education. So Stephens has the power to impact the institution. So remember our formula, racism, it has a definition. I told you, I'm not a popular guest at cocktail parties when people want to have conversations about hearts and brains and all that good stuff, because this is where I go. Racial prejudice plus the misuse of systemic and institutional power. And I'll give you a hint. Next week, I'll take you through all the isms, and they have a formula too. So think, speak, do. What are we talking about today? We are talking about cultural humility versus cultural competence. And I want you, as you get exposed to this information, those of you who are familiar with it, I ask you to continue to make additional connections, and specifically where is cultural humility and or cultural competence showing up at Stephens, right? So that we can do our work as individuals and members of different stakeholder groups or constituents. If this is new information to you, welcome. So the information I'm going to share with you is not mine. However, it absolutely transformed my life when I came to know it. So cultural humility is a term that was coined by 2 phenomenal women of color that hopefully, if technology works with us, you'll actually get to hear from them. And it was described in 1998. It's a study that you can read. And it infiltrated multiculturalism into their work as healthcare professionals. So shout out to our School of Health Sciences. It replaced the idea of cultural competency. So another hint is that I hope that today will begin your journey and your choice to choose cultural humility instead of cultural competence. Cultural humility was based on the idea of focusing on self-reflection and lifelong learning. There are three dimensions of cultural humility: lifelong reflection and critical self-reflection, recognize and challenge power imbalances for respectful partnerships, and institutional accountability. So let's go on a journey with me and hope that technology is nice to me. I had it set up before, and let's see if we can do this.
One word to describe cultural humility for me is love, actually. And I had to encapsulate cultural humility in the whole concepts of cultural humility. It doesn't adjust with the word I think about it doesn't do it justice, but the word that I think of it is essence.
Escuchar.
Be you.
Opening.
Receive. Compassion.
Love.
The principles of cultural humility offer one more framework to contribute to what has got to be our ultimate goal. Yes, our ultimate goal is that there will be a sense of equity, a sense of equality, and a kind of respect that we are driving forward.
Cultural humility is a multi-dimensional concept, and certainly Melanie Turvalon and I conceptualized three dimensions.
The first is lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. And in that critical self-reflection, it is the understanding of how each of us, every single one of us, is a complicated, multidimensional human being. Each of us comes with our own histories and stories, our heritage, our point of view. You're looking at me now. I am very fair-skinned. When I was a little girl, my hair was blonde. My eyes are blue. People often try to call me anything but African American. I have a history. My identity is rooted in that history. My parents gave me the knowledge of my own social identity, and my own experience in life has created that. I get to say who I am.
The second tenet, after self-reflection and ongoing lifelong learning and development, is this notion that we must mitigate the power imbalances, to recognize and mitigate the power imbalances that are inherent often in our clinician patient or clinician client or service provider community dynamics.
And then finally, the piece that I would offer that Jan and I feel people often either don't read or don't like, which is, and the institution has to model these principles as well.
An African-American nurse.
Sorry. We thank you for your patience and taking this journey with us for your technology.
If I had to encapsulate cultural humility, or the whole concepts of cultural humility,
it doesn't do it justice, but the word that I think of it is essence.
Escuchar.
Being you.
Opening.
Receive. Compassion.
Love.
The principles of cultural humility offer one more framework to contribute to what has got to be our ultimate goal is that there will be a sense of equity, a sense of equality, and a kind of respect that we are driving forward. Cultural humility is a multi-dimensional concept, and certainly Melanie Tervalon and I conceptualized 3 dimensions. The first is lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. And in that critical self-reflection, it is the understanding of how each of us, every single one of us, is a complicated, multidimensional human being. Each of us comes with our own histories and stories, our heritage, our point of view. You're looking at me now. I am very fair-skinned. When I was a little girl, my hair was blonde. My eyes are blue. People often try to call me anything but African-American. I have a history. My identity is rooted in that history. My parents gave me the knowledge of my own social identity, and my own experience in life has created that. I get to say who I am. The second tenet, after self-reflection and ongoing lifelong learning and development, is this notion that we must mitigate the power imbalances, to recognize and mitigate the power imbalances that are inherent often in our clinician patient or clinician client or service provider community dynamics. And then finally, the piece that I would offer that Jan and I feel people often either don't read or don't like, which is, and the institution has to model these principles as well.
An African-American nurse is caring for a middle-aged Latino woman several hours after the patient had undergone surgery. A Latino physician on a consult service approached the bedside and, noting the moaning patient, commented to the nurse that the patient appeared to be in a great deal of post-operative pain. The nurse summarily dismissed his perception, informing him that she took a course in nursing school in cross-cultural medicine and knew that Hispanic patients overexpressed the pain that they're feeling. The Latino physician had a difficult time influencing the perspective of this nurse, who focused on her self-proclaimed cultural expertise.
It was curious to this Latino physician who, first of all, was Latino, not like all, in his case, not like all Mexican Americans know everything there is to know about Mexican American patients. That wasn't it, but he might have been a resource for that African American nurse in that moment that she didn't feel like she needed, again, because she had bought into this notion of competence, of cultural competence. The distinction between cultural humility and cultural competence was that we were in a process and a relationship that had many other layers to it, and that we were less comfortable with even the term of competence in a way that I think people understand well, and that it implies, especially for people who are providers and are trained in academia, that you are then all-knowing and all-powerful. And
we felt like that was not what was happening for us as we were learning from community and understanding in a very practical way how families were coming to the hospital and feeling as if they really were not being heard from their own heritage and history, and how that impacted what they came to the hospital with that we didn't know anything about, hadn't even a clue about. For us, this is part of the humility piece of it, getting to understand that, not trying to humiliate you, not trying to make you feel bad, trying to help us all understand that life is like this, and to, in a certain sense, be really happy about not knowing. In April of 1992, in the wake of the Los Angeles riots, following the initial not guilty verdict of the police officers accused of beating Mr. King, the Children's Hospital Oakland community was compelled to meet in a series of highly charged sessions to expose and critique our own patterns of institutional racism, injustice, and inequity. My name is Dr. Melanie Turvalon, and I am Director of Multicultural Affairs here at Children's Hospital Oakland.
I want to thank everybody for coming to what is a celebration for me of this year.
Jan and I had the good fortune, really, to be together in the same place when this work was evolving. Jan and I, while we're several years difference in age, are both African-American women, and both raised by women who were teachers. And we come out of that, and fathers who were working men, who come out of that Southern tradition and who participated fully in the civil rights movement in the way that meant that they made sacrifices and their children made sacrifices, and they taught us about those sacrifices and raised us each in ways to understand that we were here to serve.
So thank you again, Lita, for troubleshooting so quickly. You are such an asset to this institution. And thank you for all attendees for going with us on this journey. So your homework assignment, because I know folks have to leave at different times, will be to watch that full movie. It's about 30 minutes, and you just watch the first 7. So your homework assignment is to completely finish viewing that film, and then again, reflect on how you see the times that we are in now, and also how you see it relevant to our work and our memberships at Stephens. So let's go a little bit further depth. So the information that you'll see now, I've organized, but it's directly from their study. And this was huge for me when I was able to put cultural humility and cultural competence right next to each other. So I don't know about your experience, but mine was in various fields. So I've been in human social services, commercial radio, community college, for-profit college, local municipality government, running my own consulting business, and now Stephens. So throughout all of those different ones, cultural competence was held as the destination, that we've done some cultural competence training, or you get a cultural competence certificate. And then when I read this study in my PhD studies, I was like broken open, because cultural humility seems so much more, right? A once a year, check the box annual training on a topic by no means made me a subject matter expert. And so why would this work around race and sexual orientation and gender and socioeconomic status and faith orientation and disability be any different? So cultural competence is about assessment. Cultural humility, commitment. Cultural competence has a very specific endpoint. Cultural humility is ongoing, active engagement. Cultural competence, it's often very narrowly defined. Oh, I took a course on LGBTQ 101, versus cultural humility is a lifelong process. So it would say for the rest of my life, I am going to be interpreting, learning, evolving my understanding of sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, behaviors, and attraction. Cultural competence, okay, check the box. Our former First Lady, Michelle Obama, talked about, and is a self-identified for the early parts of her life, a box checker. So hit a course, took a training, got a professional credential. Check, check, check. Cultural humility would say ongoing self-reflection, critiques, appraisals, something that isn't so finite. Cultural competence would put up self-proclaimed cultural expertise. Cultural humility says, let's consistently check the power imbalances via humility. So I'll give you an example of this is because I am a broadcaster by trade, oftentimes I'm asked to moderate panels or MC events. And I was emceeing a group of organizations in Pennsylvania who do work around formerly incarcerated individuals. And we got around this table and I was moderating and facilitating the discussion. And what we found out was there was not one person around that table who had experienced incarceration. But yet they're making decisions because they were in positions of power. They were executive directors or CEOs or even community liaisons. But how can we truly make policy procedures around a lived experience and no one at the table had that lived experience? Cultural competence would say, well, I took a course or I have a degree in all things incarceration. Cultural humility would say, we need to check the power imbalances and the voices of those with the lived experience of incarceration should be centered and focused. And then we support them. Essentially, we're accountable to them. Next, some more examples. Cultural competence. It is a false sense of security from a training. Again, I've had 5 trainings on LGBTQ+, or I've had 5 trainings on how to be an anti-racist. So I'm good with this. But what if those 5 trainings were 5 years ago? There's been a whole lot of evolution since then. Cultural humility would say ongoing engagement at various levels. Cultural competence, I knew. So it leads to stereotyping. In the film, if you were able to see it, and they talk about this in the study, so they gave you the visual in the film, they talk about in the clinical setting and the fact that the healthcare provider had taken a training on women of color who are stereotypically labeled to have a higher pain tolerance. So instead of listening to that patient who knows themselves the best, the individual who was providing care was like, oh, I know, Black and Latino women have a higher pain tolerance. So I'm not going to prescribe this particular remedy. So cultural competence, because of those 5 trainings I attended, I think I know everything. Versus cultural humility admits freely, I do not know what I do not know. Now that's not a scapegoat to not act, but it is okay to say, I don't know what I don't know. I don't know what it's like to navigate the world with a physical disability. I've only had temporary ones due to athletic injuries. It's okay to say, I don't know. So if I want to be an aspiring ally to those with a physical disability, I have to center their lived experience and take my instruction from them. Cultural competence, rigid, often very detached, and it's an intellectual process. I once had a gentleman tell me, cognitively, you should be able to read anything around race and not feel anything. And my response was, race is not a cognitive exercise. Racism is not a cognitive exercise. If that individual had been on a path of cultural humility, they may have been able to articulate, there's got to be flexibility in learning identification of patterns and emotions and logic, right? Cultural competence, it is, again, is about competence. It's right in the phrase, and it's about mastery versus cultural humility is about courage. It is about humility. And I know that for some, so we are not talking about humiliation. We are talking about, again, that second bullet point of just admitting you don't know. You cannot be, as Melanie said in the film, all-knowing on all things. And cultural humility focuses on the marginalized group. Again, who has that lived experience? You may have heard me at some point in any facilitation say that one of the core principles of social justice experiences is that a person of color speaks first and speaks last. Why? Because in most settings, white people speak first, last, and most often. Because those in the marginalized group, so the Black, Brown, Latinx, Indigenous person, it is more of a calculated risk if they choose to open their mouth. They could think that could risk their employment. They're thinking about how what they say could be perceived. They're thinking about their tone, their physicality of what they're going to say. So cultural humility would understand those moments and raise those folks up. We're continuing. Cultural competence, it maintains the role of expert. So again, it's an emphasis on positional power versus cultural humility relinquishes the role of expert to become the student, right? In cultural competence, we learn and practice in comfort, oftentimes very clinical environments, not actually in the community. Cultural humility would say, we've got to go show up and shut up, right? We're doing advocacy for change in the communities and practices by being in communities. One of the ways that this opened me up as I continue in this journey was the idea of open houses, right? So if an organization is going to have an open house under cultural competence, we would say, okay, let's do a couple at various times. We'll do some freebies, right? Free food and free giveaways is always a bonus. So it's very much our turf, our space, folks come to us. Versus cultural humility would say, how do we take our open house to the community? How do we eradicate barriers of transportation or knowing some attendees may do shift work of second and third shift or childcare challenges? So instead of always requiring them to come to us for an open house, how do we take the open house there? It's the difference between outreach and engagement. And some of you have been in meetings with me where I've said that it sounds like a slight language shift, but this is the academia behind it, really, and the substance behind it, right? Which is it's a two-way street and not a one-way street. Cultural competence is often, again, individually beneficial. I went to a training, I earned a credential, I'm good to go. I've increased my individual awareness and knowledge. Versus cultural humility is saying, no matter how much information I've gained, have I contributed anything? And that contribution doesn't have to be verbal. Again, it could be showing up and shutting up. It could be I'm a person in positional power and I relinquish that power to someone else because they have the lived experience. Cultural competence, academia, best practices. So again, some of you who have been in meetings with me or have seen any of my writing know that I use promising practices. And that's a very subtle form of resistance, but it's one of the many because best means, again, finite, destination, one size fits all. I've been a full-figured woman most of my life. There's very few things that are one size fits all. And if it is, most likely it was like a muumuu garment, right? It was a one size, no. That didn't speak to my style. So promising practices means, okay, we are identifying trends. We are identifying the frequency that people may do something, but it isn't a one size fits all. We're open to knowledges outside of academia. And this blew my heart open as well, because we're at a residential undergrad women's college, right? And so when we talk about feminism, or we talk about queer theory, or we talk about conflict theory, right? Many of those have knowledges that are not academic based. They are oral histories, right? They are community participatory research. It's understanding that knowledge does not just come from a published model. Knowledge does not come from a formalized canon of English literature, but there are other ways to know and be. And often those are in communities of color. And so if we're not centralizing those voices and those lived experiences, then we are doing a very narrow definition of what knowledge is. Also, cultural competence is riddled with miseducation and myths, because again, we're trying to distill it, right? When I first launched my facilitation career, the number one request was, if you bring us any handouts, make sure it's a one-pager. It was that one page. If it went to 2, they were not going to read it. They were not interested, which meant that's a lot of oversimplification. Where cultural humility, what if that document is 5 pages, but it's full of honesty? It's full of and both. It's full of saying, yeah, on the one pager, I could have a bullet point that says people of color. On cultural humility, if I'm being honest, I'm going to list those individual communities that are under the umbrella of people of color. Because yes, there are connections and there are some universal experiences, but there are also very individual experiences for those groups. So hopefully you're doing all right on this journey, and this is giving you some information. On cultural competence, only certain levels are required. And I'm not going to ask for you to raise your hand, but I want you to think about this. How many times have you all been inside of an organization and the CEOs, executive directors, COOs, CFOs, all the different letters were not required to take a training that everyone else on the entry level or middle level was expected to do? That is cultural competence in itself. Cultural humility says every single one of us, right? Because again, it's not about positional power. It is about all of us making a lifelong commitment to increase our awareness, to think about concepts in a new way, to witness folks' journeys. Cultural competence, a lot of contradictions, again, because it's stereotypes and myths. Cultural humility says, what are our relationships with communities, with history? So one of my first conversations that I had with President Lynch when I came in and started was, I presented her a piece of paper that had how I was defining constituents. And on that, I put residential undergrads, online students, graduate students, faculty, staff, alumni, board of trustees, and Como or Columbia communities. And she looked at that and took a huge breath and said, that is a lot, Shaashawn. That is like trying to be everything to everybody. And I said, absolutely. That is the goal. That's the destination. Will I ever get there? Probably not in my lifetime, but the fact that that is the foundation that and the decision that we're making to understand that Stephens is its own bubble, but Stephens also is located in the Columbia, Missouri. And when I came to interview for the position, my mouth was on the ground several times. And I thank Shannon Walls, who was my escort on that trip. And I said, all of this growth is amazing. The buildings that look like Stephens and apartments and all the private housing. And my heart is already breaking for the natives of this community, because I hadn't been physically back in Missouri for 10 or 11 years. And I knew gentrification was present. I knew Native voices had been marginalized. I knew that the 9% of people of color in Boone County had experienced an eradication of land or businesses, because that type of growth that quickly didn't happen without marginalizing certain groups. So it's important that Stephens and our work of diversity, equity, and inclusion has relationships with communities, that we know about the sharp end in Columbia, that we know, I just learned this last week, that there used to be a practice where folks would ride down on horses waving Confederate flags through the heart of downtown and through the Stephens campus. So whether people of color could come to this institution at that time, that is still part of Columbia's larger history that we need to remember. Stephens has a part in that. Some positive, some negative. Cultural competence. Accountability to self, accountability within an organization. You might not even have accountability for miseducation or mistruths. Cultural humility, gotta be accountable to someone or to others. So yes, being blunt, white people need to be accountable to people of color, right? Those of us who are able-bodied need to be accountable to people who are not able-bodied or navigate this world with a disability. Cisgender people need to be accountable to transgender people. And when we're saying accountable, we mean, right, taking direction from. sometimes, and witnessing their experiences and advocating for them. Cultural competence, often quantitative, end of the story. Now, I personally honor the quantitative researchers that we have in our institution. Shout out Dr. Trish, who is amazing with an Excel worksheet, an Excel spreadsheet, and with numbers. Definitely not one of my skill sets. But what I also honor about my colleague, Trish, is that she's qualitative too. So she understands the roles of numbers. She understands that statistics is a part of this diversity, equity, and inclusion work. She also will marry that or complement that or partner that with a case study, outcomes from a focus group. And that's cultural humility. It's mixed methodologies of measurement, of monitoring, that it's qual and quant. Because numbers, as we know, can be manipulated to paint a certain picture. We want both. Cultural competence, again, is just the training. We did it. Box check. Cultural humility, feedback loops between various stakeholders. So we learn something, and then maybe we give ourselves some time to process it, and then we come back and we talk about that, and we say, I'm still struggling with that. Or no, light bulb moment, I was able to make some connections there. Cultural competence is okay with the status quo. Cultural humility is like creativity is in everything all the time. So hopefully that was an abundance of information, and I hope that it broke you open the way that it broke me open. So this is kind of a summary. Though the font is bigger on the cultural competence part, hopefully that you have clearly seen I am advocating for us as individuals, communities, and an organization to adopt cultural humility. It is, again, showing up. Cultural humility is doing the work of feeling nervous. My question to you, and it could be a second homework assignment, is when have you done something when you knew you were going to be the small in number? So to my white colleagues, when's the last time you went somewhere where you knew that it was going to be predominantly Black or Latin or Asian or Indigenous people? Because that's doing the work of cultural humility. Because for most people of color, they are consistently navigating predominantly white spaces. We don't get that choice. When's the last time you went somewhere where you knew the majority of the room was going to be Jewish and you may identify as Christian? Have you gone to a mosque? And be that Nation of Islam mosque, which is another like subgroup, right, of those of the Islamic faith. When's the last time you went somewhere knowing you were the small in number? Most people don't, because they don't want to feel that nervousness. They don't want to feel exposed. They don't want to have to sit there and check that thing about power and privilege. But it's what we've got to do. Cultural humility, we're going to be open to learning all the time. We know that it is a journey of multiple challenges every day. It is a process, not a destination, and many of you are familiar with that. Cultural humility at its core is about relationship. And it is also a philosophy and an approach. So under cultural competence, what do we want to evolve through or beyond? We're not all knowing. So in the classroom, and I know many of the faculty, we have amazing faculty, you all already know, and you get this, that there is just as much to gain from students as there is. It is okay in that first day of class to give your own, as much comfortability as you have around it, to give a little personal statement. It's okay to be vulnerable and let students know what your passions are, how you came into teaching. If you're teaching a class that has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion, name your identities and acknowledge what you don't have. Because if you don't, you end up losing credibility. It's a piece of cultural competence. It becomes, I'm the authority figure in this classroom, versus saying, I'm going to cover a lot of these topics, but I'm covering them from these identities. And so I admit I don't know what I don't know, but I'm going to bring in guest speakers of these various identities. I'm going to put together a panel of folks within an identity who are different so that we can have that dialogue, right? We're going to stay away from just subjects or topics for the fact to just throw it out there. And it can't be about interest, right? And it can't be about the status quo. So our cultural humility is a goal that are dreams with deadlines.
Oops, sorry.
It's all good. So how did I interpret all that as I over the, and this particular presentation is probably about 3.5 years of work of, when I put it together, of thinking about this. And it boiled down to this slide, which I thought was amazing: accountability. So it's not only what we do, it is also what we do not do for which we are accountable. So let's engage. I appreciate your attention and I appreciate your listening. And I'm sure some of you were taking notes. So however that is, thank you for being receptive and open. And now we can dialogue a little bit, because what does this have to do with Stephens?